In today's episode of the first ever YouTube series, aiming to cover each and every ancient Egyptian pharaoh in depth, we're gonna be looking at the man who paved the way for all of them by finally completing the unification of Egypt. And that man's name is Narmer Namur. Came from a line of kings who ruled Thanis, an important Upper Egyptian political center, during the late 4th millennium BC. The reason I can't really give you more precise dates than this is because this all happened 5,000 years ago. So, the margin of error for dates is measured in centuries. 'Cause no one really knows when certain things actually happened. Norman could have reigned anywhere between 200 BC and 2900 BC. So since the chronology is so uncertain, let's just leave it at that anyways. Narmer's immediate predecessors, Herihor and Ka, who I covered in the last video, likely came to control most of Egypt, but hadn't fully completed the unification of the country yet. They ruled all of the northern Nile Valley, the region around the fledgling city of Memphis, and the eastern Nile Delta, but they still hadn't conquered the western delta, or the southernmost reaches of Upper Egypt, which were likely still ruled by the city of Nekhen, under its king Scorpion. He's sometimes called Scorpion number 2, to avoid confusion with the other Scorpion king we covered in the last video. The main trace of Scorpion's existence is a decorated mace, head of his found at the so-called main deposit, at the Temple of Horus at Hierakonpolis, which is Nekhen. This was discovered by James Kubel and Frederick Green while excavating there between 1897 and 1898. They also found an assortment of other objects, made to look like scorpions, or with scorpions slapped onto them. But those aren't the only cool things. From the main deposit, it also held some of the most important clues we have for Narmer's reign, including the famous Narmer palette, because the scorpion mace head looks really similar to the Norman palette. It's thought that Scorpion ruled close in time to Norman. As such, after the end of Scorpion's reign, Nekhen's domains were likely absorbed by a powerful finesse. This might have been the point when the Thonite line gained unrivaled sovereignty over Egypt. But judging by how big of a deal the conquest of the western delta was to Narmer and his successors, which we'll get to, that seems to have been when Egypt was truly unified. But before we get to that, let's look at Narmer's name. I mean, what does Narmer even mean anyway? Well, first of all, it probably wasn't even originally read as Narmer. Narmer's name consists of a catfish and a chisel. Put together, the catfish is usually read as Ner, and the chisel is read as Mer. And put together, they've been read as something along the lines of fierce catfish. But his name is often represented by the catfish sign alone. In addition, the catfish and chisel might not have been read as Gnarr and Mare and Narmer's time at all. The chisel is more often transliterated as Ah, for example, so Narmer probably wasn't even called Narmer. But there's no better name for him, so I'm just gonna stick with Narmer throughout the video. So what did Narmer's name mean then? Well, it may not have been a name at all, and was more like a symbol, associating him with catfish of all things. But that raises yet another question. Why would an armor want to associate himself with catfish? It's probably linked to the aggressive, controlling power of wild animals, with which was a common theme in art from the late pre-dating period, and was used to demonstrate royal power. In this same vein, there are some pre-dating carved ivory handles, which depict orderly registers of animals of one species being led by an animal from another species. And some of the leading animals include fish. On the so-called Brooklyn knife handle, an unidentified fish is seen controlling a line of oryx. And on the Pitt River's knife handle, a catfish does the same thing. It demonstrates that fish, and catfish especially, were somehow seen as a symbol of dominance and control around Narmer's time. This demonstrates how in Narmer's time, kingship was heavily associated with the forces of nature. But after Norman's reign, the horrid falcon perched on top of the sarcophagus, in which the king's name was contained, would become inextricably linked to the king's overall name. The king's authority became expressed through references to Horus and aspects of his nature, which were seen as being manifest in the king. For example, Narmer's successor was named Hor-Aha, meaning Horus the fighter. See, he even has a little mace. Later on in the first dynasty, which Narmer was the first king of, Narmer's name would be reinterpreted as meaning Horus, the dappled and the catfish. In his name was replaced with an animal pelt. Reading sobs so now that we know Norman's name. Let's look into his greatest accomplishment. The completion of the unification of Egypt. And the objects that testify to it. The most famous and arguably the most important document from his reign, the Norman Palette, is one of them, so let's analyze it. Let's start with its recto I. The side, where Norman's shown, about to bash a prisoner's brains out. The harpoon and lake signs next to this prisoner may denote the name of the Harpoon Nome, or province in the northwesternmost part of the delta, close to Libya. The signs have also been interpreted as the personal name Washi, and that might be the name of the prisoner. But I'm not too sure about that. Above this prisoner, Horus faces Narmer as his talons clutch a rope, which passes through the nose of a guy's head, which in turn is attached to the Landtire glyph, which 6 papyrus plants sprout from. This trippy imagery is usually interpreted as Horus delivering the land of the Pyrus, i.e. the delta, to the king. Given that the delta's heraldic plant was the papyrus, Norman himself is shown wearing the white crown, which became traditionally associated with Upper Egypt, which isn't too shocking in itself, given that there are earlier depictions of it being worn by Upper Egyptian kings. But on the other side of the palette, referred to as the verso, Narmer is shown wearing the red crown, which became traditionally associated with Lower Egypt. This is pretty important, given that it's one of the earliest extant depictions of the red crown being worn by someone, and as such its presence here probably makes Norman the first ever king to be shown wearing both the red and white crowns, although the red crown did appear way earlier as something not on someone's head, and it might have appeared on some objects from the main deposit belonging to Scorpion number 2. But it's still very possible that Narmer himself may have deliberately made the red crown the symbol of Lower Egypt. Also on the recto, Narmer is shown wearing a peculiar bull or lion's tail. And no, this doesn't make him a furry, okay. It was just another way of him expressing his association with the forces of nature. On the lowest register of the verso, Narmer is shown as a wild bull tearing down an enemy stronghold, which I know doesn't exactly help my case. But at least this is the very last representation of a ruler being represented fully as an animal, but Pharaoh still wore the bull's tail. After this, the guy holding Norm's sandals appears on the verso too. So let's just hop back there. At the top of the verso, Norm is shown in the red crown marching in a procession, heading towards 2 rows of decapitated prisoners. How fun, he is escorted by some standard bearers, a wigged figure wearing a leopard skin, and the sandal bearer again. The latter 2 are the only of Narmer's retainers to actually be labeled, so let's look into them. The guy with the leopard skin that precedes Narmer may be his eldest son, because the sign above him has been read as TT, which is probably short for this word meaning offspring. But given how long his wig is, he might actually be a she, and she might actually be Norma's wife instead. Who knows? The sandal bearer is accompanied by a rosette, a symbol denoting royal status. That was actually borrowed from the Sumerian city of Uruk and a fuller's club. This has been interpreted as meaning royal servant. But the sandal bearer could have been a more important figure in Norman's administration, given that the king's sandals were the point of contact between the king and the land he ruled. So it was a great honor to carry those smelly old things around for him. The sandal bearer was also one of the only people that could even touch the king. And the vessel the sandal bearer is shown carrying may have held liquid used to wash the king's feet. This might have been so great an honor that the position was reserved for members of the royal family only. As such, the sandal bearer may have also been meant to represent the king's son, or even his heir. The rosette might make a bit more sense then. But the person with the leopard skin and the sandal bearer don't just show up on the Namur palette. They also show up on either side of the king's podium, on the so-called Namur mace head, which was also found at the main deposit. At Hierakonpolis, they also might have shown up on the Scorpion Mesa. But the image of the sandal bearer on it has been destroyed. These courtiers are also always Khan. These courtiers are also always accompanied by the same 4 standards, which might represent the royal ancestors of the Thunite house. All these similarities suggest a complex royal protocol had already evolved by Narmer's time, and I think they might just support the theory that Narmer was actually the same person as Scorpion. Number 2. But as with a lot of things from this period, who knows? Anyways, above the horrific array of decapitated bodies are 4 symbols, including a falcon on a harpoon. This may refer again to either the aforementioned harpoon gnome or Buto, the adjacent gnome. The falcon might represent Narmer himself. Moving down, we see a little depression surrounded by 2 strange, long-necked creatures. The depression is there because these palettes were used to mix pigments together in rituals, and were probably originally used to prepare face paint worn by hunters, and so hunting scenes were initially carved into them. Before, these hunting scenes gave way to scenes depicting warfare, like on the Narmer palette. The creatures encircling the depression with their long necks are referred to as serpents. And like the rosette, there are another Mesopotamian motif. These are in fact the last important examples of Mesopotamian motifs used in Egyptian royal art, because after Namu's reign, they were dropped and replaced with native motifs. Taken together, the Namu palette was initially thought to represent an actual historical event, as in Narmer triumphing over a Lower Egyptian king, possibly based out of the city of Bukto. Then scholars started thinking that it shouldn't be taken too literally, and was either meant to depict a ritual reenactment of one of Narmer's victories, or was just purely symbolic, and meant to illustrate his dominion over Upper and Lower Egypt. But it turns out that the Narmer palette probably does represent an actual historical event, because this same event is recorded in a similar way on another artifact from Narmer's reign, discovered at Abdus, where Narmer was put to rest just in the 90s. This same artifact and a few others like it also reveal the identity of the people Narmer is shown triumphing over. On the Narmer palette, it's a year label, meaning it represents a specific year, through illustrating the most important event of said year. This actually happens to be the earliest year label known. It depicts a catfish, which somehow has arms representing Narmer smiting a bearded captive, as the catfish also grasps a clump of papyrus, which we know is a symbol of Lower Egypt, growing out of the captive's head. In that way, this captive is rather reminiscent of the personified marshland on the verso of the normal palette Because of the similarities between the Narmer palette and this label, it's likely that they both reference the same event. I know this label is a bit hard to read, but we know the thing I called the catfish is a catfish, and that it represents Narmer, because there's a chisel under the catfish, which taken together with the catfish forms Narmer's name, and of course, his sarcophagus is just to the right of the captive. Anyways, and just to the left of the captive is a little hieroglyphic of a pot, which probably reads as Nu. This is way more significant than it seems at first glance. That's because it can be read as a part of the word Chehenu, meaning Libya. There's another object, an ivory cylinder seal or handle from the main deposit, where Narmer in catfish form again is shown smiting some more prisoners. Under the catfish's tail appears the same Nu pot, which is a part of a little inscription, which reads as Ta Chehenu, which translates to the land of Libya. As such, the label and the cylinder seal both represent Narmer mounting a campaign against some Libyans. And, since they correspond closely with the Narmer palette, it's likely that the people Narmer is shown crushing on the Narmer palette were Libyans inhabiting the western delta. Narmer's victory over the Chehenu might also be represented on 2 of 3 boxes, which were reconstructed from fragments found in the vicinity of Narmer's tomb. Around 2.003, the third box holds its own secrets, which we'll get to in a sec. But all in all, it seems likely that, through basically naming a whole year after it, and having it constantly referenced In various works of art, Narmer himself really wanted to stress the importance of his triumph over the Chechenu. No other single event in the entire early dynastic period seems to have been as celebrated as this one thing. It's possible that in stressing this event so much, Narmer himself was consciously claiming to have completed the unification of Egypt, and that he was the first king of a united Egypt. After all, he and his predecessors may have been motivated to unify the country because they saw it as the fulfillment of a predestined order. The objects I just described also show how from here on out, the king is meant to protect Egypt's security and well-being from the barbarians surrounding it, and that the king is meant to preserve order in the face of chaos. In other words, the king was now a binding force of national unity. The aftermath of Narmer's victory may be represented on yet another object from the main deposit, the aforementioned Narmer mace head. Imagine if the main deposit was never found. We have no idea what Narmer got up to anyways. The scenes on the mace head are definitely set in Lower Egypt because it depicts a shrine with a pyramid on top of it. That's meant to represent a shrine located near Beth-O in the northwest delta, but the interpretations of what the mace head is meant to depict have differed over time. It was initially thought to represent Narmer marrying a Lower Egyptian princess, who's supposed to have been the figure in the carrying chair, but that might actually be the cult statue of a deity, who also shows up on the scorpion mace head. Also, Narmer's probable queen, a lady named Neith-Hotep, was probably from Upper Egypt, specifically the city of Nekata, because she was probably buried in a monumental mastaba. Found there, the location of her tomb may also suggest that she was a scion of the royal family that had ruled Nekata prior to it being absorbed by Thinis. On the other hand, her name does incorporate the name of the goddess Neith, whose cult center was Sais in Lower Egypt, so that might support the idea that she was, in fact, a Lower Egyptian princess. But either way, Narmer probably married some sort of princess. Lucky him, but it does seem pretty clear that the mace head is meant to depict, in some form, Narmer being presented with tribute from a military campaign and a metric shit ton of it. If the mace head is to be believed, 3 captives are shown kneeling before Narmer's podium, since the ancient Egyptians associated the number 3 with the concept of plurality. They probably symbolize a lot of captives. This is confirmed by the label under them, which states that there were in fact 120,000 of them. The same inscription goes on to say that the booty Narmer acquired included 400,000 cattle and 1.442 million sheep and goats. Needless to say, these numbers are probably complete BS. But a man can dream. Narmer's name alone has also been found at up to 42 different sites across Egypt, its desert fringes, Sinai, and even the southern Levant, and at far more sites than those of his predecessors, and even his immediate successors. Pottery sherds bearing Narmer's name have been found as far north as the northern Negev desert in Israel, at sites like Telephone El Arnon, El Arad, and Nahal Tullah. In total, his name has been found at 6 or more sites in Israel, so at least 5 more than his immediate predecessors, Ka and Eri Hor, whose names were only found at the site of Telephone Laod. This all shows that during Narmer's reign, business was booming between Egypt and the southern Levant. It was probably a highly structured enterprise, under the direct control of Narmer's court, and it was likely centered around the fortified settlement of Telephone Sakon. So it wasn't all business, and Egyptian soldiers were definitely present in the area. There's even a bit of evidence to suggest that Narmer launched an entire military campaign into the southern Levant. Remember those neat, fragmentary boxes found near Narmer's tomb? Well, based on the pottery depicted on one of the boxes, it's thought that the men shown stooping on it are probably Asiatic, paying tribute to Narmer, maybe as a result of such a military campaign. There's also this year label etched with another depiction of 11 vessel, which might suggest the same thing. This might not seem all that convincing, but Manetho, the 3rd century B.C. Egyptian historian, as excerpted by Eusebius, who himself is excerpted by two other authors, claims that Menes, the legendary first king of Egypt, who's probably equivalent to Narmer, went on a foreign expedition. One of them stated that he advanced with his army beyond the frontiers of his realm, winning renown by his exploits. And the other says basically the same thing, that he made a foreign expedition and won renown. But I personally don't see why this couldn't be a reference to Noma crushing the Chehenu and conquering the western Nile Delta, especially since that was way more important than any expedition to Canaan. Narmer probably couldn't have even gone on an expedition there if he hadn't consolidated his power over the whole delta. The relationship between Egypt and the southern Levant during Narmer's reign seems to have been the most active it had ever been. But the relationship quickly fell off afterwards, and the name of his successor, Aha, hasn't been found there at all. In fact, Aha's name isn't as widely attested as Namur's in general, and hasn't been found anywhere outside of Egypt. Needless to say, Narmer's name has been found at a load of sites within Egypt proper. His name has been found at least 7 sites in Lower Egypt. These include Menchet Abu Omar, Telephone Ibrahim Awad, and maybe Butho, as well as Zayat el Aran, Tura, and Helwan near Memphis. His name has also been found at Tarhan, Abdo S, Nakada, and Hierapolis, of course. In Upper Egypt, Narmer's name has even been discovered in the deserts east and west of the Nile. In the eastern desert, his name has been found in the Wadi Kash, halfway between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea coast. And in the desert west of the Nile, his name has been found at Gebel, Chouti, and Karga Oasis. Narmer's name has also been found in the Sinai, in Wadi Amara, probably because it was left by copper mining expeditions he sent there. So now that we've covered everything that we think we know about the important events of Narmer's reign, I'm going to end the video off here. But soon I'm gonna release part 2 of this exploration of Narmer's reign, which will basically be an addendum to this video, where I'll delve into Narmer's known family members, his strangely humble tomb, and his legacy as the legendary founder, King of Egypt Menes. So see you soon. Goodbye.